One of the earliest 5-stars released in the game, Ganyu quickly became a favorite among the player base, attributing to her appealing design and impressive strength in combat, especially for that time. She retained most of her popularity throughout the early part of Genshin's timeline, where her flexibility and practicality made using her pretty much a no-brainer outside of a few edge cases. For all intents and purposes, she was one of the best characters for the first year or so of Genshin Impact, and it would be rare for any player worth their salt to not use her if they had her. 3 years have come and gone, and the roster has been considerably expanded upon in almost every area, with new entries to the roster as well as retroactive buffs to existing ones increasing the level of competition for player market share, inadvertently pushing those who couldn't keep up further and further out of relevance due to rising standards of what was efficient, and causing once widely used characters to fall off. But how did Ganyu fare in all of this? Has she managed to withstand the test of time, or was she one of the unfortunate victims of age? For today's episode of What Happened To, we're going to look through the Coco Goat's history to find out where she was at the beginning and where she is now. So I'm sure by now many of you guys are aware of Ganyu's embarrassing past, evidenced by Cloud Retainer's rather cute description of her.
Plump she was back then.
Of course, nothing wrong with having a little meat on your bones, and if you like to eat as well as she did when she was younger, let me introduce you to Factor 75. Factor is back to sponsor Vars 2 once again. It's a meal prep service that delivers handmade dishes right to your door. Instead of wasting tons of money on fast food or eating out, it provides you with healthy meals pre-made and ready to eat within 2 minutes or less. The meal plans offer a variety of menu choices with a rotating selection of 34 plus options for meals and more than 36 add-ons like smoothies, keto shakes, desserts, and more, so you never have to get tired of eating the same stuff over again. Speaking of keto shakes, if you have a specific preference or diet such as keto, weight loss, or if you're vegetarian or vegan, you can adjust your selections accordingly thanks to their range of plans from 4 meals a week to 18. Factor lets you modify your food preferences pretty easily. I actually just so happen to be in the middle of my bulking season, so it's awesome to be working with Factor once again. If you're interested in trying them out, then use my QR code on screen and use my code POGVARSNO50 for 50% off your first box. Links also in the description below. Thanks again to Factor for sponsoring the video, but for now, back to what happened to Ganyu. To say that Ganyu made an impact on Genshin's early metagame would be the understatement of the year. She was effectively the first generally practical DPS character to be released. Diluc and Koting were standard banner units and therefore not reliable options for the majority of players. The order of 5-star units made available widespread went as follows: Venti, who was a sub-DPS, Klee, who was the main DPS, albeit a very niche one, Child, who technically was the first general damage dealer, but at the time not many understood him or knew of his potential yet, Zhongli, who was the tank support, and Albedo, who was anything but a main damage dealer. It wasn't until the Liyue trio, Ganyu, Xiao, and Hu Tao, when players finally had access to carry units that could definitively serve as the benchmark for what a strong unit should be, and Ganyu was the first of the 3 to arrive. Though her once unique mechanic of aim shot level 2 still took some getting used to, it was made abundantly clear that she was a cut above the available cast in many ways. Almost immediately, players took notice of the measurably higher base damage and coverage that Ganyu had to offer, far exceeding that of the likes of Diluc, Koting, Klee, and perhaps Child from an individual standpoint. Even when pitted against the units that came after, Xiao, Hu Tao, and Eula, she was at worst a contender against them and at best a superior option. There was without a doubt a lot of innate strength packed into her kit, making her highly sought after as it meant you could still get a ton out of her with modest investment. I think most of us can agree that Ganyu was one of, if not the first character to jumpstart the idea of team building and meta development in Genshin Impact, as she established expectations on damage dealers thereafter. On the subject of team building, she was among the first to be experimented on, giving rise to 2 very distinct ones: Morgana, which pioneered the notion of chain freezing, and to a lesser extent reverse melt, one of the first teams involving Bennett and Xiangling. Team building was still in its infancy and part of lacking sufficient units to compare with, but she had so much going for her that it was hard for anyone to argue to the contrary. Frostflake arrows gave her extremely consistent on-field damage, something that was absent among every other damage dealer at that time. Celestial Shower made dealing with large clusters of enemies a trivial task, and she could somewhat protect herself by diverting attention via her lotuses, making her very self-sufficient from an offensive perspective. Realistically though, Ganyu was the strongest character in Genshin throughout version 1, some may say stronger than Hu Tao. The game was also very AoE focused, with players still rounding out their exploration of the overworld, farming domains to level up their units, and spiral abyss floors consisting of groups of enemies, specifically enemies that could be pulled into Venti's vortex, as bosses didn't appear until later in the year. She was the best at what she did, mostly as a result of there being little to no alternatives. On top of that, she was a very free-to-play friendly team, effectively needing only herself and Zhongli, both units that were fully combat ready at C0 compared to Hu Tao and Xiao, whose first constellations were strongly recommended to play optimally, and even then, the current widespread approach to handling early versions of floors 9 through 12 Spiral Abyss entailed Ganyu on one side with Hu Tao on the other, replacing either with Eula, Diluc, Xiao, etc. for players who so elected to. For the better part of version 1, Ganyu was a staple for the majority of players. Kazuha's release at the tail end of version 1 accompanied by the busted transformative reactions would be the watershed moment for Genshin's metagame development. While many chose to skip him during his maiden voyage, those who were wise enough to pull for him were quick to recognize the sheer team-augmenting potential he had, and that newfound understanding would carry over into version 2, where Ganyu's endurance would be thoroughly tested. Why version 2 was so critical for Genshin and his characters was because it signaled a paradigm shift in the way we approached the game's combat. All throughout version 1, the player base pretty much did whatever, playing whoever they wanted with whatever team composition they wanted, if you could even call it a team rather than a messy assortment of characters that were the player's favorites. Any semblance of party building or team strategy was very primitive theory crafting, but by version 2, enough characters were added to where proper exploration of optimal team building not only accelerated but became more widely known even among casual players. Ganyu's first major hurdle came in the form of Ayaka, a fellow 5-star Cryo on-field damage dealer whose strength and popularity was every bit the former's equal if not more so. Ayaka's front-loaded and more concentrated damage gave the Chilean a run for her money, but fortunately there were two things that enabled the two Cryo units to coexist to some extent. For one, Ayaka's rapid attacks implicitly disqualified her from taking advantage of Melt, thus putting her exclusively into Freeze, while Ganyu at this point became somewhat more of a Melt user for more serious players, putting them in two separate fields. Secondly, Ganyu's off-field usability enabled her to shadow Ayaka, as even though you weren't able to use Frostlight arrows, her elemental skill and burst could supplement Ayaka's energy needs and coverage, making for a very deadly double Cryo combination. The second major hurdle would be a far greater challenge for her. Shortly after Ayaka was the arrival of Yoimiya, and soon after Raiden Shogun, whose advent changed the entire landscape of team building as we knew it. Not only did she establish the first widely used meta team composition in the form of Raiden National, but around this time was when the community stopped evaluating characters solely on the basis of personal damage output and more on how they contribute to the output of the collective. Alongside Raiden National came advancements in other teams that rival Ganyu's strength, Taser being one of the few all 4-star teams with incredible damage potential, and Child International gaining traction as well. Though still few in number, equally if not more competitive options began to surface that were forcing teammates like Kazuha, Bennett, and Xiangling away from Ganyu. Before, it was only really her who could make use of them efficiently. Now there was Shogun and Child. At this time, the original Liyue trio was starting to fall off a bit, with Xiao losing a substantial amount of popularity and Hu Tao starting to slowly outscale Ganyu by virtue of her more upfront burst in contrast to Ganyu's persistent DPS. Ayaka's involvement also made it difficult for any indirect buffs to come Ganyu's way, as there would always be this underlying assessment of whether said support was more valuable for one or the other. This was demonstrated through Shunhe. Surprisingly, however, Ganyu managed to hold on, if only by a little. Given Ayaka's character popularity somehow overshadowing Ganyu's, most attention went straight to her. But the one drawback of Lady Kamisato was that she was far more demanding in terms of investment and units, while Ganyu's shining trait was how affordable she was. Shunhe augmented both in different ways, with Ganyu obtaining what would basically be a retrofitted version of Melt featuring herself, Shunhe, and the Sunfire duo Jean and Bennett for massive Melt damage, although this was mostly for the really hardcore Ganyu players, most others still in regular Melt and or Freeze. It was niche, but a respectable team nonetheless. Meanwhile, Ayaka's hypercarry damage was enhanced even further. But while the two mostly stuck to their own lanes, Ganyu's market share was gradually and considerably diminishing over time. It's not because she got nerfed or that she wasn't good, it's just that she was no longer the only one. The game's roster was expanding, new teams were forming, and with that came more options. More options meant that players were considering the opportunity costs associated with every strategy. Make no mistake, Ganyu was more than capable of handling all the game's content with ease, but so were a lot of other units now, and this opportunity cost would get stretched even further and further in the second half of version 2. Yelan's inclusion was the third major hurdle of Ganyu's timeline for many reasons. The most obvious one was that she enabled Hu Tao to officially outscale Ganyu in every conceivable way. Double Hydro overnight became one of the best teams in the game, especially for how easy it was to use. Prior to that, Hu Tao mostly ran Double Geo with herself, Xingqiu, Zhongli, and Albedo, which was a bit less consistent. Double Hydro basically fixed 90% of her issues, setting the new gold standard of a conventional hypercarry team. Yelan also addressed one of the most critical pain points of Genshin, that you can only have one of every character. A big aspect of Ganyu's appeal was that her aim shot style coupled with her melt-focused team meant she didn't need Xingqiu, who could then be used for the other team. But now with Yelan, both teams could effectively have a Xingqiu on each side, or better yet, put both of them together for massive damage on one team, which meant that Bennett, given his insane utility, would naturally be used for the other team since Hu Tao didn't care to nor want to have Bennett. Calling back the opportunity costing I mentioned earlier, Ganyu was most certainly fantastic with him at her side, but she wasn't the only one. There was Raiden National, Child International, even Ayato Soup, all of which, point for point, made better use of Bennett than Ganyu did. By this point, even though a lot of the new units could work well with Ganyu, and even though her skills were still usable and splashable, opportunity cost was really starting to come into the equation, making Ganyu look less and less practical, so her equity began to diminish very quickly. Version 3 would be the fourth and final hurdle for her. Dendro's inclusion changed everything, most of which were negative for her. Having no interaction with Dendro and with the new element wasting no time commandeering the entire meta, Cryo as a whole was being pushed out and Ganyu was following suit. To give you an idea of where things are by now, Quicken and Bloom raised the damage floor of the game so high that an all 4-star team, Fischl, Shinobu, Xingqiu, and Dendro Traveler, was doing comparable damage to Ganyu's standard melt team, assuming moderate investment in both. The fact that an all 4-star team was going even with, if not beating out Ganyu's traditional team, paints a very clear picture of how far teams have come. There was some early exploration with Ganyu involving Burn Melt featuring herself, Zhongli or Kazuha, Bennett, and Nahida, which I guess you could say was Ganyu's third iteration of Melt, but pragmatically, Nahida could be used for literally anything else, and many people went that direction. Hell, Nahida even made her own version of a national team. Overall though, there were some improvements being made to existing characters, and almost none of them were going towards her. For example, many version 1 units experienced a resurgence of sorts. Kotin got Dendro, Child International entered mainstream use and attention, Shao received Farazan, Hu Tao got Yelan, technically Ganyu got Shunhe, but remember, anything Ganyu receives has to be shared with Ayaka, who in fairness was also starting to lose market share. Unlike Hu Tao and Shao, who are mostly specialists in their own fields, Ganyu was designed and marketed to be a general damage dealer, but by being a jack of all trades, you leave yourself vulnerable to being eclipsed by specialists, and that's exactly what happened to Ganyu. Bountiful Bloom, Hyper Bloom, Aggravate, Spread, all forms of National, all forms of Taser, all form of Hyper Carry. There were so many teams, so many options in this game, each with their own specialty that makes them that much better in certain scenarios, which made their opportunity cost a lot more favorable than Ganyu's. Presently, she has no niche. Everything she does can be done by someone else better, and the hard part is that Dendro sets such a high barrier to entry with the sheer numbers it could pump out that even 4-star Dendro teams can compete with old 5-star teams. In practical terms, the competition caught up to Ganyu. Objectively, she's still to this day more than powerful enough to take on anything and everything in the game, and very comfortably too. I myself still use Ganyu for floors with a lot of Hydra enemies just because of how easy she is to use, but therein lies the point. Ganyu was solved a long time ago. There isn't much more room for development if there's any at all. Meanwhile, other characters like Shao, Child, and whatnot still had tons of room to explore and develop, and they got it. Moreover, the landscape of Genshin's combat is being pushed further and further away from Cryo, and more specifically Ganyu's playstyle being AoE coverage. Many of Genshin's best teams are very single target driven, while any teams that specialize in AoE far outclass Ganyu's rate of coverage, with the only method of recourse being Venti. Ganyu's story is different from the likes of Eula, Ito, and whatnot. She wasn't exactly hamstrung by anything. She did receive support. Units like Kazuha, Kokomi, Nahida, Yelan, Shogun, all of them, in some way, shape, or form, to varying degrees of course, can help out Ganyu, whether it's by enhancing her total damage, boosting her elemental damage, helping her clear with area coverage, or whatever. The problem was that those other units could help out other characters a lot more, so indirectly, Ganyu went from being a top tier must-play to a strong serviceable character to a decent albeit niche pick to now being stuck in a limbo state where she's by no means a bad unit by any stretch of the imagination, but she also doesn't make a big enough splash in anything anymore. Other characters and other teams came out that were either better than her or equally as good, giving players more things to choose from. On top of that, everything that once made her unique is no longer unique. In the realm of aimshot level 2s, we have a lot to go with now. Tignati, Linny, and even Nivelen, who isn't a bow user but basically has a level 2 aimshot built into his kit. So the concept of enhancing charge attacks on ranged weaponry is commonplace now, in addition to Tignati and Nivelen having ways to accelerate their aimshot to be almost instant, whereas Ganyu can only do that with Constellation 6, so they have more instant DPS. Sustained damage was another aspect of her that was really valuable, but now many characters of all elements have permanent or near permanent uptime, and besides, extended combat was all but phased out of Genshin's metagame until it was reinstated by Neuvillette. Everything in version 2 and version 3 revolved around quick swap ability rotation, including even hypercarry teams whose main attacker only stayed out for a small bit of time before swapping out to refresh everything. So keeping one person on field for 15 plus seconds was only really a thing of version 1 when team comps were practically non-existent. Area coverage, like I said earlier, many teams have good area coverage now, particularly those who can use Venti, Kazuha, and Sucrose, so Ganyu's Celestial Shower having massive range isn't as spectacular as it used to be. I guess you can say, in an ironic twist of events, just as Ganyu power crept the units that came out before her by offering a lot of unique ways to do stuff, being more efficient at doing that stuff, and also being the only one who could do that stuff, the game upped this caliber of units to where you now have a plethora of options to choose from. Even if they don't necessarily fit the same niche of freeze or melt to her, the end result of clearing dungeons, bosses, abyss, etc. can be accomplished by dozens of units who are at worst equal in strength to her. In other words, Ganyu's power went from being the exception to the rule. To repeat once more, she's still perfectly viable and usable, but it's also apparent that the current direction of the game is veering away from her. A lot more bosses, which meant that freeze is falling off, version 4's units pushing the meta towards a new direction. Extenuating circumstances will also make it challenging for her to return to her former glory, even if such opportunity were to present itself. I think it's safe to say that Ganyu's time in the spotlight has run its course. Though in her defense, all things considered, she was in that spotlight for a very long time. But yeah, this was the first What Happened To episode that went from positive to negative, and it was all one of my favorite units, but I suppose not every character can have a happy ending. Anyways, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know your thoughts on Ganyu in the comments down below. Aside from that, if you haven't already, it would be great if you gave this video a like and subscribe to the channel, really appreciate it. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other What Happened To episodes after this one. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.